You ready to rock and roll here, Mr.?
Anytime you are, Mr. Chairman.
Committee will come to order. We want to thank our distinguished panel of witnesses for being here today. Members will be trickling in and out. You know how these things, many of you have testified before, and members' schedules are busy, but we want to get started and respect everyone's time. We'll do opening statements, then we'll get right to each of you and introduce you and swear you in here in just a second. Where's my opening statement? Today's hearing continues the committee's ongoing oversight of the IRS's inappropriate treatment of conservative groups applying for tax-exempt status. The IRS has doubled down on its targeting and is now seeking to codify their actions. On November 29, 2013, the IRS issued a proposed regulation under the guise of clarifying the tax-exempt determinations process. As we will hear today, this rule, if implemented, will stifle speech of social welfare organizations and will systematize the targeting of nonprofit organizations. The administration is using the controversy surrounding the targeting of tax-exempt groups as a pretense for the need for this regulation. In reality, this is Lois Lerner's final act in the administration's effort to curb political speech. We know that this effort was in the works well before the release of the Inspector General's audit. Through the committee's investigation, we've uncovered evidence that Ms. Lerner sought to crack down on political speech by certain nonprofit groups as early as 2010, well before the rule was made public. Emails show the IRS was surreptitiously working on this effort off-plan. In fact, the committee's investigation has revealed that the administration secretly considered additional regulation of 501c4 organizations for years. In transcribed interviews, Treasury officials have confirmed that work on changing the rules for social welfare groups started long before the Inspector General's report. For example, Ruth Madrigal, a senior official in the Treasury Department's Office of Tax Policy, confirmed that she suggested that Treasury conduct its work offline in June of 2012. She testified that we had requests to do guidance on this topic. Former IRS Acting Commissioner provided further context for the request that the IRS and the Treasury received. He testified that as of the fall of 2012, quote, "So I'm not sure there was a problem, right? I mean, we had Senator Levin complaining bitterly about our regulation. That was older than me. We were being asked to take a look at that, and so we were thinking about what things could be done," close quote. Think about that. The IRS and the Treasury, under the guise of responding to the targeting scandal, have proposed a crackdown on political speech that has secretly been in the works for years and is the result of political pressure from Democrats in Congress and left-wing special interest groups. A chilling effect can already be seen. Groups who have engaged in political speech for years are now in limbo about how to proceed for fear that the IRS will retroactively look back at their activities through the lens of the new regulation and determine they are in violation of their tax status. The rule is hugely unpopular, receiving over 94,000 comments. Record number of comments. Highest number the IRS has ever received on any proposed rule. My understanding is the second highest in the history of any government agency. 94,000 comments, and rest assured, the vast majority of those are negative. The rule has been criticized by groups across the political spectrum, as well as by groups who have nothing to do with politics and simply advocate for causes their members believe in, such as some of our witnesses here today. Make no mistake, the proposed regulation will seriously hinder the freedom of speech guaranteed by our Constitution. And I think this is important. You think about the First Amendment and the rights we enjoy as Americans: freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom to assemble, freedom of speech. And the most fundamental component of that freedom to speech right is your right to speak out against your government, your right to exercise speech that's political in nature. And this government, this IRS, is targeting that very thing. And that's why this hearing is so important and why I'm glad that our witnesses are with us today. I want to thank all of you for being here. We appreciate your courage in speaking out against this effort to crack down on your ability to engage in political speech. We'll do everything in our power to ensure that you continue to be able to exercise this fundamental constitutional right. And with that, I would yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to all the witnesses. Thank you for being here. Look forward to hearing your testimony. Today's hearing is intended to discuss the merits of the IRS and Treasury Department's proposed rule clarifying the definition of political campaign activity for 501c4 organizations. This rule is a positive first step towards providing much-needed clarity and guidance for tax-exempt social welfare organizations. Unfortunately, the title of today's hearing, here in Washington, it's not like jury trials. We start off our hearings with titles. If you showed up at a criminal defense trial and it said, the title of our trial is Why the Defendant is a Criminal and Must Go to Jail. We're not quite so open-minded here in Washington. The title of today's hearing is a not-so-subtle clue that some members will use these proceedings as another opportunity to lob bombs at the White House and the Obama administration. As I explained yesterday, after multiple hearings, extensive witness interviews, and the review of thousands of documents, this committee has uncovered no evidence that the White House was involved in the treatment of tax-exempt organizations or their applications. Likewise, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, TIGTA, has repeatedly testified that he found no evidence of outside influence, White House or otherwise, in how the IRS personnel processed applications. What the IG's report on exempt organization did find is that the applications experienced delays not because of political bias, but in part because the IRS employees struggled without specific guidance on how to determine whether social welfare was, quote, the primary activity, unquote, of these organizations. As Mr. George explained, Treasury regulations state that IRC Section 501c4 organizations should have social welfare as their primary activity. However, the regulations do not define how to measure whether social welfare is an organization's primary activity. As a result of this long-standing ambiguity, the IG recommended that the IRS create better guidance on how to process 501c4 applications and work with Treasury to develop guidance on how to measure what is primary activity. In direct response to the IG's recommendations, the IRS and Treasury developed a proposed rule to clarify the definition of political campaign activity and requested public input to ensure the standards are clear and can be applied consistently. Despite these facts, on February 4th, Chairman Jordan and Issa demanded that the IRS Commissioner Koskinen withdraw the proposed rule, claiming it was an attempt to, quote, as we heard this morning, stifle political speech, unquote, by conservative 501c4 organizations. There is no evidence to support my colleague's partisan accusation, but it seems the House Republicans will stop at nothing to keep the American public in the dark about dark money and always in a high state of political outrage. Furthermore, there is nothing in the proposed rule that restricts any form of political speech. Political groups can still be tax-exempt organizations under the IRC Section 527. They simply would be required to disclose their donors. And that's the big point today, is that they don't want their donors disclosed. We're not here about stifling free speech, ladies and gentlemen. To any Americans listening to this subcommittee hearing, what's being stifled, what is being attempted to be stifled is stifling your freedom to find out where the money behind political campaigns is coming from. This is an attempt to crack down on transparency in American elections. Make no mistake, that's what this is about, to hide where the dark money is coming from. It is counterproductive to demand that the proposed rule be withdrawn, especially in light of the very real and clear need for more guidance on the issue. Regardless of our specific views on the proposed rule, I hope we can at least agree that IRS employees and organizations seeking 501c4 tax-exempt status need to have clear, easy-to-follow guidance about what is permissible and impermissible. Many, including me, have also called for a return to the language of the 501c4 statute itself, requiring that these organizations be, quote, operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare, unquote, instead of using the current primary activity test. To this end, I have introduced the Open Act, which would require both corporations and unions to disclose their political spending to shareholders and members. It would also cap political spending by 501c4 organizations at 10% of annual expenditures. And this is a legislation that will help shine a light on that dark money funding political activities in the United States of America. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today on this important issue, and I yield back to the chairman.
I think the ranking member's comments, I certainly appreciate the ranking member, but his revisionist history is astounding. The idea that conservative groups were not targeted when there was a specific list called the BOLO list, which had these terms on it, 912, Tea Party, and Patriot, and somehow that was not targeting, just dismisses the facts that I think the vast majority of Americans understand, and certainly many of those 94,000 comments understand. With that, I would yield to the chairman of the full committee for his opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I listened with interest at your ranking member. And Mr. Cartwright, you're certainly entitled to your opinions. They couldn't be more wrong, but you're entitled to them. Dark money, 501c4, organize for action. The president's own agenda, perhaps $1 billion in 501c4 money unreported. Beautiful picture of the president standing in front of a windmill on the splash page of this 501c4. Of course, it says donate as the first item you see. And then it says organizing for action is the grassroots movement fighting for the agenda Americans voted for in 2012. We are millions of people empowering individuals to make their voices heard. Climate change comes next. Gun violence prevention. Health care, helping millions of Americans learn how Obamacare works. Oh, okay, there's something you can have a lot of trouble getting them to believe. Fixing our broken immigration citizen, a pathway to citizenship. Advocating for a pathway to citizenship. The list is the president's political agenda. It is millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars that are not reported as to their source. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the small donor being able to give without retribution, without the IRS going after the donors, putting their lists online, having them intimidated for who they support. I'm okay with that. And you should be too. Americans' right to donate without tax deduction at all. And make one thing perfectly clear. This is not tax deductible. This is not charity contribution. This is a pooling of Americans' post-tax money to do what they want to do. It is no different, Mr. Cartwright, than if you sat in a room and you got 10 guys and you said, you know, let's all put in $50 apiece and buy an ad to say what we believe. And you each take your $50 and you buy a $500 ad. Would you expect to have to go through endless filing and have all your donors, disclosed? But make no doubt about it, the president did this and did it very well. His 501c4 didn't bother to go through the abuse because his lawyers knew that they didn't need to. They simply self-declared and went on. Organize for Action is as political as any organization in the world. And to say that it is somehow organizing the way Wikipedia does for social welfare is as much hogwash as any other organization could dream of. It is advocating the president's political policies and promoting the election of the candidates who work with him. Your only objection is you can't go on the House floor and yell about the Koch brothers the way Senator Reid did. You can't talk about specific monies because you're not getting to know who gave how much. This is an amazing debate that has absolutely nothing to do with what happened to law-abiding citizens who saw the tax code, made an application, and from application one, they were sent to, among others, Lois Lerner, and they were stopped. This wasn't about ambiguity. A man who has put more than 4 decades into being at the IRS fully recommended that these be approved, and his approval was simply not discussed. The facts do not support any of the allegation the ranking member made in his opening statement. Our investigation shows consistently effective targeting by denial of an answer to organizations. You know, the American people deserve answers. If anyone thinks for a moment that it takes years to answer the question of whether or not you get a 501c4 on even one application, if they really believe that, please call or write my office. Because the fact is, even the people who want to be on the other side of this know you deserve an answer in days or weeks, not waiting years. The months ticked by for these organizations, and the only thing they got were abusive questions. Questions that in many cases were outside the legal or even the reasonable right to request. So I would certainly hope, Mr. Chairman, that your ranking member and the rest of us on the committee will go back to the basics, which has nothing to do with whether a 501c4 discloses its contributors, whether or not we change the rules one way or the other based on longstanding court decisions, whether or not the President's Organized for Action has in fact done far more than any Tea Party group ever dreamed of doing when it came for advocating political positions. We simply look at the facts of the IRS getting involved in a partisan, or let me rephrase that, an ideological political bent. The ACLU is here today and other groups who have stood on both sides to stop conservatives from taking advantage of liberals, liberals taking advantage of conservatives, the many taking advantage of the few. And I hope today what we hear is the danger of allowing a federal agency to pick winners and losers regardless of the ideology. Mr. Chairman, there can be no more important hearing. That's why I came here personally to it. This may be a subcommittee hearing, but this is one of the most important hearings we'll do this year. And I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentleman from North Carolina wish to be recognized? Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to point out, if we could, my esteemed colleague from the great state of Pennsylvania was pointing out that indeed that this rule change is a result of the IG's report. Now, I find that troubling because, quite frankly, we already have knowledge that there was a rule change in effect long before the IG's report came out, Mr. Chairman. If you would put up a slide, if they could put up a slide on the screen here, there's an email that we have that from June the 14th, 2012, basically saying that what we were going to do is, don't know who in your organization is keeping tabs on C4s, but since we mentioned potentially addressing them off plan in 2013, I've got it on my radar up, and this seems interesting. Now, the problem is that if the genesis of this was the IG's report, we have a time problem, Mr. Chairman, because the IG's report did not get filed and completed in until 2013, and yet here we have an email from June 14th of 2012. So I think it's important that we have a timeline, and just wanted to correct that for the record. I yield back.
Appreciate the gentleman. Excuse me, anyone else wish to make an opening statement? If not, let's get, I'll go ahead, the gentleman from,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and because a lot going on. I think what's really interesting here is the use of, as has also been said, and I think we just continue to jump off and you take what's given, is the use of this hearing, as spoken by the ranking member, to lob bombs at this administration. I think all you got to do is go find 93,000 comments that have done that for us. I don't think this is a time when we can look at what's actually happened and say, why is this happening? Why are we doing this now, and what are we distracting from? We're distracting from the real issues and the real problems of this country that are a broken healthcare system, a broken system that is driving our businesses and our employees to a brink of not understanding why their federal government's against them. And yet we're still dealing with this on saying, we don't want you to have a voice. Mr. Chairman, this is a good hearing. This is something we need to take a part in, and realizing that this is an area that people care about because they care about our country and the direction that it's in right now. This is why we need to be here. And like I said, we don't need this hearing to lob bombs. 93,000 folks plus or more have already said this is a bad idea and we need to stop it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We are pleased to have with us today Ms. Jenny Beth Martin, who is the president and co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. Mr. Gabriel Rotman is a legislative counsel and policy advisor at the American Civil Liberties Union. The Honorable Wayne Allard, Senator, good to have you with us, is vice president of government relations for the American Motorcyclist Association. Ms. Diana Aviv is the president and CEO of the Independent Sector. And Mr. James R. Mason III is senior counsel at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I might point out an association that my wife and I used to contribute money to. I think Mr. Meadows did the same. We homeschooled, well, I use the term we lightly. My wife did all the work for several years, and so we appreciate your organization. Glad to have you with us. And Mr. Alan Dickerson is the legal director at the Center for Competitive Politics. We want to thank our distinguished guests. It's the practice of this committee to have you stand, raise your right hand, and swear you in. So if you'll please all stand up. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Let the record show that each witness answered in the affirmative. And we will start with the lady. Jenny Beth Martin, you are recognized.
Chairman Jordan and members of the subcommittee, thank you for conducting this hearing today and for inviting me to share my story. It is absolutely imperative that members of Congress understand what is going on with the IRS, what has been going on, and what is still going on. I'm holding in my hand an email I received yesterday from Tea Party Patriots attorney. An email that was received less than 24 hours before our 5-year anniversary event today across Capitol Hill. This email was received less than 24 hours before the deadline for commenting on the proposed IRS regulations. And this email was received less than 24 hours before my testimony here today. What does it say? It says that yesterday, the IRS finally decided, after more than 3 years and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and accounting fees and countless hours of volunteer and staff time answering questions and questions and questions and more questions from the IRS, that finally the IRS has decided to grant us our 501c4 status. We don't have a letter yet from the IRS, but they told my attorney in a phone call. Now, I'm happy to receive this information. It's about time. Mr. Chairman, the question I have is, what took them so long? Tea Party Patriots has not engaged in any political activities, none. We made a conscious decision from the beginning not to engage in political activities, and that did not keep the IRS from withholding our exempt status for more than 3 years and investigating our organization that entire time. I'm happy and relieved to have received the information, but I still wonder what took them so long. We have not engaged in political activities. The IRS should have been able to determine that within a few months of receiving our application in December of 2010. After all, these regulations, which talk about the primary purpose for social welfare organizations, have been in place since 1959, over a decade before I was born and before man landed on the moon. Perhaps the reason for the delay of these regulations is that the IRS is what we're here today to talk about, the proposed regulations from the IRS that they issued just before Thanksgiving. If those regulations are enacted, yesterday's approval will be moot. The new definition of political activity could not be more targeted at Tea Party Patriots if the IRS had spent the last 3 years 2 months, and 10 days drafting rules specifically to silence us. I have attached my written testimony to the copy of I've attached to my written testimony the copy of the comments we're submitting to the IRS. We outline a great many of the constitutional and practical problems with these regulations. Let me highlight just a few. One of the most egregious is the requirement that we track, calculate, report the activity of thousands of volunteers. The Army of citizens who volunteer for their country is the backbone of every group in America, Tea Party, moderate, or progressive. Volunteerism is one of the greatest character traits of our country. These proposed regulations would treat volunteers as a problem, annihilating relationships that are the heart of an informed electorate. Furthermore, Tea Party Patriots provides grants to local groups, always requiring the grants are not used for political activity. Under the new regulations, a grantee group's decision to use its own funds for an event as innocuous as a nonpartisan voter registration drive would become our political activity. That standard would gut our ability to assist local groups. The new regulations would censor the internet. Tea Party Patriots would not be able to mention any incumbent on our website within 30 days of a primary or 60 days before a general election. We'd have to scrub our website of any mention anywhere in it of information just as basic of how elected representatives voted on the Affordable Care Act, federal spending, or just historic voting information. The proposed rules would attribute to us the value of the remarks by our leaders and our volunteers. If in September of this year, the New York Times quoted a volunteer or me about a congressman's voting record, we'd have to place monetary value if the New York Times reported that. The proposed rules create cracks in the trust of the foundation of our nation. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people is supposed to trust the people, and the people should be able to trust our government. When the people are afraid of an agency and they see that agency as a bunch of bullies who abuse power, the trust is shattered. Free people shouldn't fear a politicized bureaucracy that delves into social media and communications to determine what they've said, whom they've heard speak, and what they think about their government. We can't fill these cracks in the foundation by adding more rules to the 67,000 pages of oppressive tax code. We personally favor replacing it with a flat, fair rate. And until then, Mr. Chairman, the government must fulfill its duty and stop the IRS from infringing on the rights of the American people to freely associate, speak their minds, talk to the press, and petition their government.
Thank you. I failed to mention 5 minutes, more or less. We try to keep it less, but Ms. Martin did fine. She was just a few seconds over, so hopefully we'll maintain that. We're going to go to Ms. Aviv, and then we'll go right down the line. So, Ms. Aviv, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Jordan, Representative Cartwright, and members of the subcommittee. Independent Sector is a leadership forum for charities, foundations, and corporate giving programs whose member networks collectively represent tens of thousands of organizations nationally, locally, and globally. Our membership also includes a number of 501c4 welfare organizations, social welfare organizations. And thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you the perspectives of our community today. Charitable organizations understand that continued support from Americans who give their time and money depends upon the public trust in our sector, and that any erosion of that trust will ultimately limit our effectiveness and harm those that we serve. We are therefore deeply committed to ensuring that all charitable nonprofit organizations are governed effectively and transparently, maintain maximum accountability, and demonstrate highest levels of ethical conduct and fully comply with the law. As part of our commitment to supporting responsible practice, Independent Sector for some time has been deeply concerned about the rules governing political activity by 501c4 social welfare organizations and have advocated 3 changes. First, it's imperative that a clear definition of political activity across all 501c organizations be created so that exempt organizations and regulators are no longer forced to rely on the ambiguous facts and circumstances approach to determine whether and to what extent political activity has actually taken place. Secondly, a clear limit should be established for how much political activity is permitted by 501c4 organizations. Doing so will provide certainty for exempt organizations and remove the subjective judgment of case officers at the IRS. Thirdly, the rules must ensure that all 501c entities lawfully permitted to engage in partisan political activity are transparent regarding the source of donations used for those activities. When clearly defined and within appropriate limits, political activity can be an important part of advancing the missions of these organizations. But it must be conducted in a way that organizes the electorate's right to know who is working to influence the outcome of elections. We sought and welcomed the IRS's recognition of the need to improve the current rules, but the recently proposed regulations fail to address some of the most serious problems I've just outlined. At the same time, in the areas it does address, we believe that the IRS has overreached in a deeply problematic way. The proposed guidance includes an overly broad definition of candidates-related political activities that conflates partisan with long-standing, widely accepted non-partisan activities. For the first time, activities such as non-partisan voter registration efforts, get-out-the-vote campaigns, voter guides, and non-partisan candidates forums that encourage civic participation and educate the general public would be considered political. Defining non-partisan voter engagement activities as political for 501c4 social welfare organizations will have a deleterious, cascading effect on 501c3 public charities. Given the express prohibition for C3 organizations to engage in candidate-related political activity, risk-sensitive public charities and their funders may curtail their activities in order to avoid association with activities that the IRS would then deem as political. Furthermore, the proposed guidance would define as candidate-related political activity any public communication that clearly identifies a candidate or any forum where a candidate appears within 30 days of a primary or 60 days within a general election. This would include any effort to influence legislation during the blackout period that refers to an elected official who is running for re-election. Such a rule would have limited the ability of 501c4 organizations to engage with or publicly mention lawmakers during consideration of the $700 million TARP bank bailout bill passed just before the 2008 election. A uniform set of rules that applies across all tax-exempt categories will provide predictability and clarity for what constitutes political activity, will protect free speech, and will encourage civic engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Aviv. Mr. Rotman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Cartwright, members of the subcommittee, I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the troubling rule proposed by the Internal Revenue Service. We believe that, if implemented, the sweeping new definition of candidate-related political activity in the rule will chill a vast amount of debate on matters in the public interest. By way of illustration, had these rules been in place during the presidential race in 2012, the ACLU would have been limited in its ability to even mention President Obama or Governor Romney during a period covering almost 300 days of that year. Were we to do so, even in a completely nonpartisan way, it would have counted against our allowance of candidate-related political activity, too much of which would jeopardize our 501c4 status. During 30 days before any primary and 60 days before the general election, we would have had to purge all such communications from our website, including thousands of individual web pages, or account for them in our tax filings. In fact, this testimony, Mr. Chairman, would have to come down just because I mentioned your name. The proposed rule would not be an improvement on the existing standard. Earlier this month, the ACLU submitted comments critical of the current facts and circumstances test, the inherent vagueness of which likely led to the use of inappropriate criteria in the selection of conservative and some progressive groups for undue scrutiny. We further noted that the IRS's proposed alternative would make matters worse by chilling legitimate issue advocacy while doing very little to address the perceived problem of anonymously funded campaign ads. For these and other reasons, we have concerns with several provisions in the rule. We oppose the proposed application of the rule to communications merely mentioning a candidate within the 30 days before a primary and 60 days before a general election. The IRS's proposal is so broad that it would cover such communications if they were posted to a website before the blackout period and kept up during that time. Indeed, in the 60 days before a general election, remarkably, we would be limited in our ability to even mention any political party represented in the election. Totally nonpartisan communications like urge Democrats and Republicans to unite in support of NSA surveillance reform would be covered. We also oppose the extension of the definition of candidate-related political activity to advocacy communications that are the functional equivalent of express advocacy. Historically, government regulators have been unable to draw appropriate lines between communications urging voters to support or oppose a candidate and those that urge action on an issue in the public interest. The ACLU itself has repeatedly run afoul of this functional equivalence problem. In the 1970s, for instance, the New York Times refused to run a sharply worded advertisement criticizing then-President Richard Nixon for opposing court-ordered desegregation. The New York Times believed that to be a campaign ad. Communications by groups like the NAACP or the National Organization for Women on issues like voter identification laws or reproductive rights could also qualify depending on where and how they run. Finally, we have strong concerns with the inclusion in the proposed rule of totally nonpartisan voter registration, mobilization, and education efforts, and candidate forums within the 60-day blackout period. While the IRS does deserve credit for taking action here, the rule unfortunately attempts to cast as broad a net as possible rather than narrowly targeting actual electioneering using explicit terms of support or opposition. In America, the First Amendment disfavors regulations that suppress protected speech to get at unprotected speech. The regulations do exactly that. They give the tie to the censor, not the speaker. Regardless of the politics involved, that should be of concern to any advocate for the public interest. Thank you again for inviting me to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Rotten. We appreciate that. Senator Allard.
Chairman Jordan and Ranking Member Cartwright and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting the American Motorcyclist Association to speak today and discuss the rule proposed by the Federal Internal Revenue Service designed to provide guidance to tax-exempt organizations. The AMA believes this rule will limit our ability to communicate with our members and will create a de facto blackout period during which our government will be less accountable to the people it serves. Currently, the IRS provides a tax exemption for civic leagues or organizations not organized for profit but operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. The AMA is exactly that type of organization that lawmakers anticipated granting tax-exempt status to when they drafted Section 501c4. The AMA provides enormous social benefit to the motorcycling community. As an organization, we sanction about 3,000 competition and recreational events a year. In sanctioning with the AMA, event promoters and recreational events a year, with the AMA, event promoters and track owners agree to use the AMA rulebook and operate their events in a safe manner with set minimum insurance levels. As a result, participants in these events know they will be treated fairly and in a safe manner. On the highway, we provide numerous benefits to our members, including sanctioning charity rides, which include providing insurance and best practices to make the roadways safer for riders and drivers, providing roadside assistance to our members, and educating and informing our members regarding congressional and regulatory actions. The AMA represents the interests of our nation's estimated 27 million motorcyclists and all-terrain vehicle riders. Any fact-intensive analysis takes into account all of the facts and circumstances of the AMA and its functions would conclude that the AMA promotes the social welfare of motocross racers, recreational off-highway vehicle riders, on-highway motorcyclists, and drivers. We do not participate in elections. Since 1984, the AMA has been classified as a 501c4 organization based upon this analysis. However, the IRS new guidance would force the AMA to either to muzzle its advocacy efforts or lose its status as a tax-exempt organization. The definition of candidate-related political activity the IRS proposes to use is arbitrary and limits free speech. For example, any communication mentioning an elected official's name is considered political activity during the 60-day period before a general election or 30-day period before a primary election. This creates an odd situation. The timing of the speech is what makes political, not the content. According to the proposed rule, it even includes material without regard to whether the public communication is intended to influence the election or some other non-electoral actions, such as a vote on pending legislation. As a result, the new definition of candidate-related political activity assumes that all congressional, regulatory, and executive actions cease before an election. We know this is not the case. Legislative and regulatory business is conducted right up to an election. This creates a de facto blackout period during which citizens will find it much harder to gain information about the actions of their representatives and government. The U.S. House of Representatives is scheduled to be in session for 12 days during the proposed rules blackout. Additionally, the reauthorization of MAP 21, our nation's transportation bill, an important vehicle to road safety programs, may be debated and voted on during this time. We must be allowed to communicate information about such issues to our members in a timely manner. According to George Mason's University United States Election Project, less than 54% of eligible voters cast a ballot in 2012. This is a decline of more than 3% than the 2008 presidential election. At a time when the proportion of eligible voters casting a ballot is declining, the AMA opposes any effort to restrict access to voter registration drives, voter guides, and information related to their representatives' voting records. In fact, this is a time when more voter educational material is needed, specifically pertaining to issues Americans care about. The proposed rule the IRS seeks to implement will stifle nonpartisan speech in a manner that leads to a less informed electorate. We believe that the changes proposed will prevent the AMA from educating voters and advocating for the social welfare of the motorcycling community. Even the IRS agrees, stating in the rule itself, more definitive rules might fail to capture activities that would or would not be captured under the IRS traditional facts and circumstances approach. It is our understanding that the IRS hoped to curtail electoral activity, but this rule is limiting our ability to educate our members about congressional and regulatory activity in keeping with our objective to promote social welfare of the motorcycling community. Thank you very much for your time and consideration of the American Motorcycle Association's views.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Mason.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and honorable members, thank you for the honor of being invited to testify before this committee. Homeschool Legal Defense Association is a social welfare organization that is tax exempt under Section 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code. I oversee HSLDA's compliance with numerous state and federal tax laws, campaign finance laws, lobbying laws, and other areas of government affairs. In a previous job, I worked on several important campaign finance cases in which federal courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States, struck down regulations of political speech as being unconstitutional under the First Amendment. The constitutional issues and those in many other campaign finance cases are closely related to the constitutional issues raised by the IRS's proposed rules. HSLDA is a national organization that has as its primary purpose advancing and protecting the right of parents to educate their children at home. We have over 80,000 member families in all 50 states in the district, and we communicate with many thousands more by various channels, including email, website, news media, and personal appearances at conferences. Many social welfare organizations like ours from across the political spectrum are dedicated to giving a voice to the people so that together they can affect social change. These social welfare organizations like ours are made up of millions of people who wish to speak with one voice on issues of importance to them. One of HSLDA's main activities is monitoring state, federal, local legislation. When a bill, ordinance, regulation, or policy change is proposed that will affect the ability of parents to homeschool, we frequently alert our members and friends about the proposal. Sometimes we urge them to contact their elected officials by name to express their support or opposition to the proposed legislation. We communicate with homeschoolers about legislative issues to advance our policy goals in ways that we believe are in the public interest. Under current law, we need not worry about whether a particular elected official is also a candidate, or whether an election is near when legislation is introduced. But under the proposed rules' 30 and 60-day pre-election windows, what would be an issue advocacy communication on Monday would be a candidate-related political activity on Tuesday, without changing a single word. Even worse, if the issue advocacy communication is posted on our website on Monday, by some strange IRS alchemy, it would be magically transformed into a candidate-related political activity on Tuesday. The IRS justifies its expansive definition of candidate-related political activity by the need for bright-line rules. We agree that a bright-line rule is preferable to placing IRS agents in charge of deciding whose speech is protected and whose is not. But according to the notice of proposed rulemaking, quote, the IRS acknowledges that the approach taken in these proposed regulations, while clearer, may be more restrictive and more permissive than the current approach. In some cases, a bright-line rule may be a good thing, but not all bright-line rules are created equal. In this case, the aspects of the bright-line rule that are, quote, more restrictive actually abridge protected free speech. In the interest of clarity, the IRS approach has captured too much speech. Issue advocacy does not become express advocacy based on arbitrary dates on the calendar, and the need to speak out on issues of public importance does not decrease as Election Day approaches. Indeed, issue speech becomes all the more valuable because the public and officials are paying closer attention. The IRS's Bright-Line Rule is designed to prevent impermissible use of tax-exempt status, but because it captures too much speech, the proposed rule is contrary to decades of Supreme Court precedents that hold that the better approach is to err on the side of regulating less speech, even if it means missing some that might properly be subject to regulation, to avoid improperly abridging any protected speech. As the Court has said, but such a prophylaxis upon prophylaxis approach to regulating expression is not consistent with strict scrutiny. The desire for a bright-line rule hardly constitutes the compelling state interest necessary to justify any infringement on First Amendment freedom. The IRS proposed rules would damage HSLDA, other social welfare organizations, and the public's ability to keep abreast of issues that are important to a healthy civil government. The proposed rules are also contrary to the free speech clause of the First Amendment. We strongly oppose the proposed rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mason. Mr. Dickerson.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Cartwright, members of the committee. I'm going to try not to repeat everything you've already heard from the panel, but I do want to make a few points. One is, because this involves a regulation of the Internal Revenue Service, one might be forgiven for thinking that this involves in some ways the collection of the nation's revenue. It does not. There's no reason to believe one way or the other that revenue will rise if this is adopted or that it will fall if this is adopted. And the reason for that was already made clear by the chairman of the full committee earlier. The organizations we were talking about do not receive tax-deductible money. So if this doesn't involve the internal revenue, why exactly is the IRS involved in the first place? And isn't it odd that something called candidate-related political activity would be regulated by the IRS at all, given that we already have a commission called the Federal Election Commission, which would seem to be somewhat more competent in this area? I would suggest that the reason for this is simple and structural. When this Congress gave the Federal Election Commission, quote, exclusive jurisdiction over the civil remedies and enforcement of the nation's election laws, it made a structural choice. There are 6 members of the commission, unlike the usual 5, and they are evenly divided between the 2 parties. The reason for this is simple. No one party may, using the Federal Election Commission, take a partisan advantage. The IRS does not have that safeguard. I will leave it to the committee to draw its own conclusions. One of the things the FEC has that the IRS doesn't is the institutional competence that comes from 40 years of regulation in this area. And going back to this idea of clarity and whether these rules in fact provide clarity, I practice generally in the federal election area, mostly in campaign finance cases. And there you have real clarity. You have financial cutoffs. Something is a type of communication if you spend $10,000 on it, not if people volunteered and we somehow have to value their time in this very amorphous and unpredictable manner. We know that something is directed at an electorate if it can be found under FCC regulations to reach 50,000 voters of the person being identified. Unlike here, where it says that something is candidate-related if it is intended, and for the lawyers in the room, we all know the wiggle room in there, that it is intended to reach 500 persons. The difference between a broadcast ad that's taken out in a member's home state, intended to reach that person's electorate, and something put on YouTube is enormous, and it's a trap for the unwary and for small organizations. So in that sense, I would suggest that even if the facts and circumstances test lacks clarity, and it most certainly does, there are other areas here where the clarity is perhaps worse. In this attempt to create a patina of predictability and a patina of sensible regulation, you actually have buried in the NPRM a number of things that are very troubling. For instance, how do we know when someone's a candidate? Well, under the FEC rules, we know someone's a candidate when they spend money as a candidate through an authorized candidate committee. How do we know someone's a candidate under this? Well, when someone proposes them as a candidate for office. Full stop. Theoretically, if I were to suggest Mr. Cartwright as the next vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party, I would have converted him into a candidate for that office. Now, presumably this could be dealt with later on in the process, but the fact that the IRS saw fit to use that as its standard suggests, if not a political intention, at least a lack of institutional competence in this area, which perhaps give us a certain amount of pause about the IRS regulating this in the first place. And I think it's important to deal with the elephant in the room, which is disclosure. The fact, as I said earlier, is that there is no revenue purpose to this rule. It's about the disclosure of people's donors. And I want to tackle that straight head on. The reason 501c4s do not disclose their donors is because Congress said so. When the Internal Revenue Code was passed, it created criminal penalties for the unauthorized disclosure of the donors to these organizations. And the reason for that is that it has always been understood that 501c4s are the beating heart of civil society. These are the organizations like the NRA and the Sierra Club, which go out there and take unpopular positions and move the national debate and make this a vibrant and functioning democracy. Requiring unpopular organizations to give up their donor list to public scrutiny is not only contrary to Congress's intention in the Internal Revenue Code, it's also contrary to constitutional law. In a number of very hard-fought victories during the Civil Rights era, the Supreme Court said unanimously that organizations could not be required to give up their donors unless there was a strict and important overriding governmental interest. And the reason for that was that the court noted the ability to speak is undeniably helped by the ability to associate. And chilling the ability to associate inevitably makes it less likely that speech will be effective and that 501c4s will continue to be able to do their job as civil society. Thank you.
Well said, Mr. Dickerson. That's why freedom of assembly and freedom of speech are in the same darn amendment. They're very, very important. Before turning to the vice chair of the committee, I would just I don't know who's for this rule. We got the Center for Competitive Politics and the independent sector opposed to it. We have homeschoolers and Harley riders opposed to it. We have the Tea Party and the ACLU. I mean, who's for this? I mean, this is we could stop right now. You guys did a tremendous, we could say, this thing's done. Get rid of this crazy thing. But we probably can't do that because members of Congress like to talk too, and they want to ask some questions. So we're going to go first to the Vice Chairman, Mr. DeSantis, the gentleman from Florida.
Well, maybe after this presentation, the administration will agree to just pull the rule. I mean, I was very impressed with what I saw. Look, I think this rule is going to have a chilling effect on speech. I think it's going to facilitate the type of targeting that we've seen, unfortunately. And really of concern to me particularly is I don't think government should be in the speech police business generally, but certainly you shouldn't have the IRS doing this. And this committee has uncovered emails back in 2012, one email from a Treasury Department official to, among others, Lois Lerner at the IRS, said, don't know who in your organization is keeping tabs on C4s, but since we mentioned potentially addressing them off-plan in 2013, I've got my radar up, and this seemed interesting. And of course, Stephen Miller has testified about trying to, quote, level the playing field between 501c4 groups and 527 organizations based on pressure from Senator Levin and others in Congress. And so to me, I think that the IRS needs to get out of this entirely. But, you talk about like a 30, 60-day window. That is precisely the time where people need to be able to engage on public issues. I mean, it is just absolutely ridiculous. But I think what it does is it stems government's desire or government muzzling of speech in this context is really rooted in the desire of incumbents to control discourse. Because if you can control who can speak, the people who are here now are going to be more likely to be returned to office. And if more people can speak and get involved, then it becomes more competitive and it's more difficult to continue to get returned if you're held accountable. I appreciate Mr. Dickerson talking about the anonymity and the donor disclosure. I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Rodman, because I read in your testimony you do talk about that. Is it your group's position that there is value in having these social welfare groups for them to be able to keep their donors anonymous?
Congressman, yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. The right to anonymous political speech, I mean, as Mr. Dickerson said, was hardened during the civil rights era, but it goes back to the founding of this country.
And why was that? I mean, I assume you agree with NAACP versus Alabama, where basically Alabama had a law that required donor disclosure if you wanted to operate in Alabama. And so the NAACP would have to have disclosed their donors. So just for people who may not be familiar with that case, why would that have a chilling effect on First Amendment speech at that time?
Well, it was quite literally an attempt to intimidate the NAACP into leaving the state. By disclosing the membership list, it would have left the members of the NAACP open to reprisal, which at the time, would be completely expected. So the court found that in that case, if there's a chance of harassment or reprisal, then the right to anonymous political speech is constitutionally guaranteed.
Yes, and I would just remind folks who may be watching, the Federalist Papers were anonymous. I mean, this was the one most potent mechanism that the Founding Fathers used to get the Constitution ratified in New York, which was the critical thing at the time, was that they had lost in New York, they probably would have lost and wouldn't have gotten ratification. And so Hamilton didn't sign the essays, Madison didn't sign the essays, and John Jay didn't sign the essays under their names. They signed it as Publius. And of course, during the American Revolution, you had all kind of pamphleteers. This was one of the main ways where people were able to be educated about these things. Many of those were written anonymously or written under pseudonyms. And so, I think that there's just such a desire in this town to control everything that goes on that we end up seeing proposed rules like this. But I'll just say I really appreciate the chairman having the hearing. Thanks to all the witnesses. I think you all made very good and logical statements. And I think we can stop this rule from taking effect in Congress and just make sure that we want a robust debate. We want people getting involved in political education and issue education, and that's part of what being American is all about. So I yield back the balance of my time.
I think the gentleman would recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you for the comments from all of the witnesses. And I listened, I learned, and I appreciate your attendance today. I was born in 1961, and I say that because it was 2 years before I was even born that this country, the United States of America, placed restrictions on political activity by 501c4s. So anyone listening to this hearing who thinks that this new rule being proposed is introducing a novel concept is sadly mistaken. This has been part of the American fabric since 2 years before I was born, and I'm getting pretty long in the tooth myself. What we're up to right now is trying to craft a rule that answers what everybody's been screaming about on Capitol Hill. You know, is the IRS unfairly targeting right-wing groups? We know that there were BOLOs on right-wing groups. We also know that there were BOLOs on left-wing groups. We haven't sorted through the statistics to see what percentage of the right-wing groups were targeted, what percentage of the left-wing groups were targeted. Maybe someday we'll engage in that exercise. But what we're up to right now is try to make clearer rules because even though the FEC does know a lot about political campaign finance rules, since 1959, it has been the charge of the IRS to handle some of that as well. Now, Ms. Aviv, I particularly appreciated your testimony because rather than scrap everything, what you've done is you've come up with some clear and cogent suggestions on tightening this rule up. They appear on page 6 of your written testimony, and rather than go through them, I just want to thank you for those intelligent suggestions. And we also had Senator Allard. I appreciate your testimony here, and I want to say it's an honor to have a former United States Senator testifying before our subcommittee. I also appreciated your points about the time restrictions. I think that's worth looking into. I think you make some sensible comments. I mean, having served here on Capitol Hill, you know about the business that goes on here and you know, the day-in, work-a-day work that we do here and dealing with interest groups and their concerns. And I appreciate your comments, and I hope that your thoughts will be taken into consideration. Remember, everyone, this is a proposed rule. It is malleable. It is subject to change. We are not wasting our time and our breath here because there are people paying attention to your comments. And Senator Allard, I appreciate yours as well. Now, Ms. Aviv, I wanted to follow up with you a little bit. As I mentioned at the outset, really what my concern is about is the elephant in the room that Mr. Dickerson mentioned, and that is the dark money. The dark money. I mean, on the one hand, we have concerns about First Amendment freedom of speech and political expression. On the other hand, we worry in this country about undisclosed donors, you know, who they are, where they're from. Are they even from this country? The people pumping money into who gets elected in this country. And I wanted to follow up with you, Ms. Aviv. Why do you think there is public concern about the increase in partisan activity funded by dark money?
Mr. Cartwright, I'm going to come at this question from the perspective of the charitable sector. I started off my testimony by saying that we depend on the public trust. We know that the public likes charitable organizations, 501c3 and 501c4 organizations, to be involved in educating about the issues, communicating with lawmakers, with elected and appointed officials, and all of that. They're also very clear that they don't want us involved in partisan political activity, in determining who's sitting there, but once people are sitting there, for us to engage. Our concern with 501c4 social welfare organizations is that they have the right to do both of those activities.
Right, and you said that. In fact, you wrote in the Washington Post that this proposed rule could be an important first step in pushing dark money into the sunlight and providing IRS examiners with objective tools for reviewing applicants for tax exemption. Did you say that?
Yes, but we hoped that's what it would do. Our concern is that these rules as currently crafted don't do that. We have an equal concern that we simply throw out these rules and nothing happens. We think that the current law is not workable, and we think that these rules as crafted are the wrong way to go.
Well, thank you for that. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter her op-ed in the Washington Post for the record.
Without objection.
I also got, Mr. Chairman, I got an email from Richard Painter, Professor Painter, from yesterday's hearing, talking about, he said, so far I have not heard facts suggesting involvement in this scandal of anyone at the White House. I hope the rhetoric in the course of this investigation will not get ahead of the facts, and I'd ask permission to enter this email into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from
Mr. Chairman,
gentleman from floor is recognized for a response.
could we maybe put into the record the number of times that officials from the IRS visited the White House, if we're going to put that in? I know the committee has previously uncovered that. Maybe we can just note that for the record, if that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine, without objection. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Though I have lived in Tennessee for over 20 years, Senator Allard, I grew up in a town you may have heard of a little north of your home state, Sturgis, South Dakota. I guess you probably advocate for a few of the AMA folks there.
Yes, sir.
And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe you've been there.
I have not, but we have a lot of members that go there.
Okay. The American Motorcycle Association is not a political party, correct?
It's not a political party, that's correct.
Okay. And it's an organization dedicated to advocacy for the motorcycle community, right?
It's a social welfare organization, and we promote responsible and safety behavior on our roads and when they're out on our public lands.
So what do you think then the big concern about the AMA advocating for issues and talking to elected officials would be?
There shouldn't be any concern because we are a social welfare organization. We're prohibited from being partisan in our activity. And I might give you an example. We do list all the candidates for office on our website. And we also send out a questionnaire, and we put that questionnaire on the website verbatim. It's not, we don't edit it or anything else. We're just there to educate our members, and then they can understand what the members are doing and in the Congress, and they can understand our issues. And the highway transportation bill, for example, comes up during that dark period. And we have a lot of issues in there, and we can't mention a bill carried by so-and-so.
Right.
That would prohibit us from doing that.
And so this would end that, this rule
Yes.
would end that. Ms. Martin, the ranking member now for 2 days in a row has indicated that we really don't know if this targeting was a bipartisan process, that conservative groups were targeted and liberal groups were targeted. I saw you making some notes after that statement. Do you have any information that would help the ranking member with who was targeted and who wasn't?
The Inspector General's report said that 100% of conservative groups were targeted.
And the number of liberal groups that were targeted, I believe all of them received their status.
They all received their status, including one for 501c3 named after the president's father, Barack Obama Foundation. It was a C3, and it was approved by Lois Lerner.
How long does it typically take an organization to receive tax-exempt status?
Prior to late 2009, it took somewhere between 2 to 4 months, maybe 6 months at the most. After the beginning of 2010 or very late 2009, it seems 2010, it took years, at least for organizations like mine with Tea Party and Patriots in their name, or conservative organizations.
Why do you think that you were targeted specifically? What do you think the underlying purpose was? Just open and honestly, why do you think you were targeted?
I think we were targeted because people in the IRS and other parts of this government did not want to hear from the people. They wanted us to be quiet.
Do you really believe it was the IRS? I mean, the IRS doesn't want you to speak, or do you think maybe it was somebody higher up the chain?
I want to see what the evidence says. I try my best not to make jump to conclusions with this. It certainly seems that there were quite a few people who did not want us speaking, and they've done everything they can to silence us.
Do you think there was a lot of conservative people that didn't want to see you speaking?
I would hope not. I have a feeling there may even be some Republicans who from time to time don't want to hear us speaking, because we are nonpartisan and we hold both parties accountable.
Okay, how does, after going through what you've been through the last several years, your organization, other conservative groups, how does it make you feel after, finally getting tax exempt status after being put off for years? How does it make you feel now that they want to invoke this rule?
Well, so just before coming here to testify, I receive a call, or our attorneys receive a call saying we've finally been approved. If these regulations go into effect, that approval is absolutely meaningless. The organization Tea Party Patriots has lived under these rules for the past 3 years. We may be one of the only national organizations who truly knows the effect of what it's like to keep the mountains of paperwork, to watch every single word you say, whether you even say Obamacare or the health care law, because using the word Obama in Obamacare may count against you somehow. It's oppressive, and it's very, very frustrating. I didn't want to have to go through that. I don't want any organization to go through it, even one who disagrees with me on all of the issues. No organization in America should have to go through this.
And I think we have a table full of them represented here today, so thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Just real quickly before going to the gentleman from Michigan. So the ranking member mentioned 1959, but it seems to me the history for 50 years, from 1959 to 2009, we didn't really have a problem. And then suddenly, we got a huge problem, and we got a new rule that's proposed offline. So for 50 years, this thing worked fine, but something changed in 2009, right?
In 2009, 5 years ago to today, this movement, the modern-day Tea Party movement, started.
Yeah, but something changed at the IRS, which happened to correspond with the modern-day Tea Party movement. All right, thank you. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Cartwright, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I want to thank all of the witnesses who have taken time from their busy schedules to come and testify today about this very, very important issue. Ms. Jenny Beth Martin, you and I go way back, right? In fact, I got involved in politics because of the Tea Party.
Yes, sir.
And I remember then jokingly saying if we really wanted to control speech, we should hook up our politicians to lie detectors. It'll be the quietest campaign season in history, right? And we've been talking about the First Amendment here this morning, which is one of our basic rights put into the Constitution by our founding fathers. It's a fundamental right and pretty important one, isn't it? Yeah. This amendment gave the people the right to prohibit the federal government from exercising authority over freedom of speech, and the founding fathers did note that this right was not absolute and must operate under reasonable restrictions, but the intent was for the states to establish these standards, not the federal government. I'm guessing all of you here today know what the First Amendment says, correct? Everybody? Do you think the employees at the IRS know what the First Amendment says, Ms. Martin?
If I would imagine no, they do not, because if they did, there's
Because of your
no way
past
they would
experience.
not have done, they would, if they knew what the First Amendment said, they wouldn't have done what they've done to my organization and others like ours.
Mr. Rotman?
I'm not sure that that's actually the question that needs to be answered, whether they do or not. The fact is that the rule as proposed could be misused to target groups on both the right and the left, and that should
I
be of
understand.
concern to all of us.
Yeah, a lawyer, right?
Yes.
Okay. First Amendment, Senator. Do you think the IRS understands?
I'm not a lawyer, by the way. I'm a veterinarian.
There you go. Yes.
But let me point out, I think there probably are some employees there that understand. I think there's, if they reflect the total population, a lot of employees that don't. And in regard to this rule, I think they completely ignored the First Amendment.
Ms. David?
So I think that the IRS employees are charged with fulfilling the their responsibilities according to the rules. The rules are so unclear that using facts and circumstances allows individual agents to make personal determinations about what is right and wrong. We think that we need greater clarity so that there is less discretion left up to them.
In the interest of time, I think you would probably say pretty much what they said. But in the hearing we had back in May of last year, I asked Mr. Schulman of the IRS, who is a lawyer, by the way, if he knew the First, Second, and 19th Amendments. He told me he didn't have the Constitution memorized. Do you think IRS agents should have a right to training in the Constitution and Bill of Rights? I think they should know, basically, even though they're attorneys, what the Constitution says. Would you agree, Mr. Rotman? I mean, case law, constitutional law, that's for lawyers. But basically.
I mean, the fundamental problem is that they're given too much discretion under both the existing rule and the proposed rule, and that discretion is going to lead to problems regardless of who's in office.
Right. But it's a basic right. I mean, a constituent came to me one time and asked, Mr. Mitvolio, I don't like this, this type of noise coming from this particular church. And I said, well, if I did that, I'd have to pass a law that said, get rid of, church bells. And I'm not going to do that because it's freedom of religion. And I'm here to protect those rights, just like freedom of speech, right? I don't really have that many questions, but Ms. Martin, we go a long way. I think you're responsible for my and much of America's great political awakening that took place since 2009. I want to thank you for that. Don't let this get you down. We're fighting the good fight. Our job here in Congress is to protect those rights, not take them away.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Gentleman yields back. I'm going to recognize the ranking member for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I want to address this idea of everything coming up since 2009 now. What was I doing talking about 1959 if everything started in 2009? Well, I want to first invite everyone's attention to 1979. I was born then. I was graduating high school then. In 1979, an IRS General Counsel memorandum referred to the, quote, perennially troublesome question, unquote, of whether the regulations implementing 501c4 should be changed. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter that memo as from 1979 in the record.
The memo will be entered into the record.
So it was already a perennially troublesome question in 1979. I'll take you forward to 2004, also before 2009. Members of the American Bar Association's forgive me for mentioning lawyers, evidently that's out of fashion. The American Bar Association's Committee on Exempt Organizations proposed that the IRS design a, quote, simplified, clear, and predictable alternative test for 501c4 qualification. So they were concerned about that at the ABA in 2004, and then in 2006. George Washington University Law School professor Miriam Galston observed in 2006, quote, since the late 1970s, there appears to have been no serious consideration given to changing either the, quote, primarily aspect of the exempt purpose standard in the regulations or the IRS's application of the standard in its rulings or other pronouncements, unquote. So I'm here to tell you that for anyone to say that there was some kind of epiphany that this nation had in 2009.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I yield.
Well, my point was this. In the 50 years, I don't ever recall reading stories, hearing any information about it taking 3 years to get approved when you applied for whatever tax exempt status you were applying for. That was my point. In 50 years, it never took anyone 3 years to get approval. But since 2009, it's taken 3 years for hundreds of groups. That was my point.
Well, I certainly will credit the chairman with being much more elderly than I am and have a fuller view of history.
Well, is any of the thing, do you have any evidence that people were denied their tax exempt status and had to wait 3 years from 1959 through 2009? If you can produce that, produce it.
You know, that's a fundamental flaw of this entire Oversight and Government Reform Committee and all of its subcommittees, is that we constantly say, well, there's no evidence, you know, that the president isn't a murderer. So therefore, we feel justified in suggesting.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't bring up the year 1959. The ranking member did. And I'm saying that based on this committee's investigation,
Right.
we know the delays happened after 2009.
And do you have evidence that there were no groups that had to wait 2 or 3 years, say in the 1970s or the 1980s? Do you have evidence of that, Mr. Jordan?
I don't.
So therefore, it must have happened, or it must not have happened. Let's stop engaging in
Mr.
this.
Chairman?
There's no evidence of
Chairman?
as proof of the opposite.
Gentlemen.
I yield back.
Gentleman from Ohio, the chairman is recognized.
I would just ask to also enter into the record a letter sent yesterday, 2 days ago, from the Treasury, Alistair Fitzpaine, Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, sent to the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and would highlight on page 2, beginning in 2010, beginning in 2010, it doesn't say 1959 anywhere in this letter. Beginning in 2010, this is from the Treasury. Treasury and the IRS received requests from members of Congress and others to consider engaging in rulemaking to clarify the rules regarding social welfare organizations. Beginning in 2000, the very first sentence in that portion of the letter, Mr. Chairman. So I'd ask ask that this be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with Mr. Rotman. Mr. Rotman, just again to highlight how ridiculous this rule as proposed is. Let's say this October, the ACLU wanted to sponsor a debate between Mr. Cartwright and Mr. DeSantis on the Second Amendment, host that event. Could you, in fact, do that?
In October, we could, but we'd have to count it against our permissible allotment of candidate-related political activity. And if that, in the aggregate, was to go over our permissible allotment, then we would, our 501c4 exempt status would be jeopardized.
Okay, could you even, after the fact, let's say a local college was hosting an event, you weren't, could you comment on the event after it took place? Could you send someone there and comment on what the folks, what Mr. DeSantis, Mr. Cartwright had to say about the Second Amendment? Could you do that?
It would be the same issue.
Counting
because
against you?
It would be counted against us, yes, even if we didn't mention your name, actually, because the topic itself could be at issue in the election, and that would qualify under the rule as clearly identifying a candidate.
Okay, what if you just wanted to host a candidate, let's say for some reason Mr. Cartwright moved to Florida and wanted to run against Mr. DeSantis. Could you sponsor a debate between those two candidates this October, short time before the election?
Again, it would be counted.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, that's the absurdity of it. I think about in Ohio, our primary election is in early May, and on tax day, if a Tea Party organization wants to have me come speak at their event, they'd be in the same boat. Same kind of thing. Again, just how ridiculous this rule is. Let me go to Ms. Martin. This is something that bothers me too. Just the timing of things we now get from our government, this administration. You familiar with Catherine Engelbrecht, Ms. Martin?
Yes, sir.
And Ms. Engelbrecht testified in front of this committee a couple weeks ago. Did an outstanding job. And what we discovered in that hearing was that Ms. Engelbrecht, for 20 years, her and her husband had ran a successful business. She had never had any interaction with OSHA in that 20 years. She had never had any interaction with the FBI in that 20 years. She had never had any interaction with ATF in that 20 years. And her only interaction with the IRS in that 20 years was filing her annual return. And then she starts to do the same thing you do. She applies for tax-exempt status for her organization called True the Vote, and suddenly her world changes. After she applies, the FBI visited her 6 times. Not in the course of the criminal investigation at the Justice Department, before that started. But between when she applied and when the criminal investigation started, the FBI visited her 6 times, 2 in person, 4 on the phone. ATF showed up at her business. OSHA showed up at her business, and the IRS audited both her personal and business records. And if you remember that hearing, the Democratic side said that was just one big coincidence. Just Shazam, it just happened, you know? Now, you come to us today and you tell us the rule, comment for the rule ends today. You're testifying today. You applied for tax exempt status 3 years ago, and suddenly, yesterday, you get an email from the IRS saying, by golly, we finally got around to you, right? We finally figured it out. You're now approved.
Exactly.
One big coincidence again.
It's apparently a pure coincidence and no political motivation and no smidgen of corruption.
Why? You know why I think it took so long for them to approve you, and you know why I think they went after Ms. Engelbrecht the full way the federal government came up, Ms. Engelbrecht? Why do you think it took them 3 years for you?
I think that I cannot answer what was going through their mind. All I can do is say that looking...
Hazard a guess, why?
I think that they wanted me to be able to come in here, and if I were asked, did you receive your status approval, I would have to testify yes.
Yeah, but I'm asking about, I mean, I think you get harassed. I think you received the treatment you did. I think Ms. Engelbrecht received the treatment she did because you're effective, right? You're actually making a difference in the political process, just like Catherine Engelbrecht was, and they couldn't have that. No, we can't. We're going to have the full way the federal government come down on you. We're going to make you wait 3 years, which from 1959 to 2009 took weeks or months.
That's correct. The time involved to do this, no organization should have to go through this. When we should have been able to talk about issues or Supreme Court hearings, instead, I would be working all day long and literally go back to a hotel room and spend another few hours dealing with accountants and attorneys to make sure I complied. And the questions they were asking me, regardless of the targeting, which happened, regardless of that,
Oh, yeah,
the
I've seen
questions
them.
they were asking me
I've seen
are the questions they will be asking every single person on this panel.
Yep.
And it's, the time and the money involved is enormous.
Yep. I'm a little over time, but if I could, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mason, and I just thought of this, because I remember when this happened in I think it was the early 90s. There was a proposed change in law that would have essentially put homeschoolers out of business. Parents wouldn't have been able to exercise that option. Because I remember hearing about it on the radio, and I remember my wife calling me up and saying, I'm on the phone, and she's calling friends who also homeschooled, and they mobilized in a way that I think this place had probably never seen before. If this rule was in place, could you have had the same impact that you were able to, and you won that debate. That rule was, it was stopped, or that law was stopped, or proposed law was stopped. If this rule's in place, could you have that same kind of impact that you had back in the 90s?
It would be very doubtful because everything that we did was contacting elected officials, and if, that was H.R. 6, by the way.
Sure was.
And,
What year was that?
Kind of
Refresh my memory, Mr. Mason, what year was that?
94?
Yeah.
Yes, 1994. My organization at that time wasn't real savvy in email and internet, as probably most of us were not. So a lot of it was done by real grassroots effort, phone trees and just people contacting each other. You get the word out and it gets spread. And a lot of it was contact your member of Congress and oppose this. I believe we shut down the Congressional switchboard.
Sure did.
If that had occurred, especially during somebody's primary election, it would have counted against us as political candidate-related political activity. And on that score, I'd like to address one point. Every minute would have to be tracked by every employee of a social welfare organization, because you'd have to be able to determine what amount of time and overhead expenses were being used for these candidate-related political activities. It's an enormous amount of effort and paperwork, and when you add onto that 50 states all regulating political speech, all regulating lobbying, all regulating charitable solicitations. The amount of paperwork that an organization like ours has to do and the amount of care we have to take to avoid getting in trouble is enormous.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mason. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Jordan. That was a good line of questioning to help, I think, explain the burdensome nature of this. Mr. Rotman, you're not normally seen as a right-wing Neanderthal Republican. Would that be a correct assessment?
I think that's fair.
And the history of the ACLU is one of being as independent and as willing to object to Congress's or the administration's actions regardless of popularity. Isn't that true?
Absolutely.
I'm very proud of the ACLU. Sometimes my current pride is not as great as my historic pride. I might think back to the internment of American citizens in World War II, and the ACLU bravely said it may be popular, but it's not right. The ACLU has always stood for a number of constitutional amendments and support, and we always hear about the First Amendment. But for a moment, give me your answer on freedom of association, and I'll give you an environment. If I'm a homeowners association, I've got 200 homes, and everybody's paying into a homeowners association with after-tax money, and that association is doing the usual good social work of deciding whether or not we should have gates in our community or whatever the other items are, whether we're going to re-slurry the road. And then there's a proposed power line coming through our community. And we say, well, we need to use a little of our money, from which we got no tax deduction, and we need to be able to meet, and we need to be able to push against this absurdity that will diminish our values of our home. Is there really any difference between that freedom of association and the basic freedom of association of Ms. Martin's group that gets together and talk and holds up copies of the Constitution and says, God, we got to save our country. We've got to explain to people that this is what our founding fathers left to us as inalienable rights?
Mr. Chairman, I think that brings up exactly the concern with this proposed rule, and that is that it doesn't deal with partisan political activity. It extends the definition of partisan political activity to fundamentally nonpartisan issue advocacy. And you're absolutely right. The rights to freedom of speech and the corollary right to freedom of association are essential when we're talking and debating about the issues of the day, regardless of which side of the political spectrum we land on. And that fundamentally, it would be one thing if we were talking about partisan politicking. This rule is not about partisan politicking. It is about regulating fully protected issue advocacy by social welfare groups.
Senator, you and I have a long history of looking at these issues in minute detail. You've looked undoubtedly at the question of what 527s can do and how they do it. Essentially, isn't the biggest difference that if you're a 501c4 like Ms. Martin, congratulations, by the way, after only 3 years, you're an overnight success. But when we look at these things, aren't we really having a discussion about what entity can advocate for or against an elected official and what entity can do other things but not advocate for or against an elected official? Isn't that really what defines the difference between a 527, of which there are many, and super PACs and the like, and 501c4s, in your opinion, years of looking at it?
Yeah, well, 501c4s are prohibited from participating in partisan activity.
And therefore, the intent of the Federal Election Commission, something where Lois Lerner worked for a period of time, is 527s, they get to look at. Other groups that advocate for or against, try to bring down somebody like you or me, or promote by bringing us down the person running against us. That's an activity in which the FEC and Congress has determined that there needs to be transparency as to donors, right?
That's correct.
And when you get to issue advocacy, including Organized for Action, President Obama's well-connected, it isn't just his picture on the cover, it's him raising the money for it, organization, they're prohibited from trying to defeat me directly. They can simply turn out people who disagree with my views, right?
That's correct.
So the president is well within his rights because it's issues. Does anyone think that the attempt by the IRS to organize the 501c4 isn't essentially to bring it within the FEC? All of you at the table, I'd love to have each of your responses, because to me, that's what I see, is I see these rules designed to say to, and I'm going to call it my homeowners association for a moment, although Ms. Martin's new organization could follow in that too. They just basically want to bring us under the Federal Election Commission as though our organizations exist for purposes of electing or defeating federal officers. Right down the row.
Chairman Issa, after the 2012 election, and because of the questions we were being asked by the IRS, we actually did form a 527 super PAC, just so that when we got close to an election, we can mention a candidate's name. We truly have been living under these regulations for 3 years, and now, today, we don't have to, and we may have to again very soon.
Mr. Rodman.
I'm not sure, I think that the regulations, they go even further than that, right? What they
I mean, they're worse than
what they do is they conflate fundamentally non-political issue advocacy with partisan politicking, and they make that the definition of candidate-related political activity. So I'm not sure that it's an administrative question. I think it's fundamentally erring on the side of suppressing speech in order to get at absolutely anything that could be problematic, as opposed to erring on the side of caution and erring on the side of free speech.
So similar to putting in federal agents in broadcast studios to see whether the news reporting rose to political activity, maybe.
Right. Actually, we came out the opposite way on that, but.
You thought it was okay to go in there and see if they were being fair and balanced at MSNBC?
We didn't feel that it was coercive, what the FCC was doing, and therefore, if it's not coercive, then there's no First Amendment issue.
Yeah, no, that's a federal agent sitting in my office never intimidated me. Senator?
We are basically a social organization.
That advocates for helmet laws.
And safe driving and responsible behavior, whether it's on public lands or
But
whatever.
that leads to legislation, rulemaking, and so on.
That's correct.
So you fall right in the trap of they want to call you political because you'd like to make sure that dirt bikers have access to dirt.
We're prohibited by federal law from being active in partisan politics.
But this rule would sweep you
That's
into
correct.
calling partisan politics just trying to make sure that dirt bikers have dirt.
That's correct.
Ms. Avil?
Mr. Chairman, we're focused on C3 and C4 organizations, and we see C4, 501c4 social welfare organizations as different than 527s, since their primary purpose is supposed to be a social benefit purpose, but can engage in some partisan political activity. Our concern with this rule is what has been expressed by, I think, everybody on this panel, which is that it goes too far and it doesn't address the problems that have been talked about in the media and by this committee and others in the last number of months, which is to define what political activity is, to limit the scope of what IRS agents have by way of personal opinions or judgment calls, because there are clear criteria of what political activity includes, and not to include long-standing activities that are part and parcel of the American fabric that C3 organizations can do and C4 organizations have long been doing.
Thank you, Ms. Mason.
Thank you, Congressman. I think that it's maybe a little different than what you think, and it's probably worse. In the Federal Election Campaign Act, all of these kinds of regulations have a long history. It's well litigated. There's a very precise and distinction between issue advocacy and express advocacy. That's been frustrating to those who think that more speech should be regulated, because under the case law, the FEC case law, less speech is regulated. So now it's not that it's bringing speech into the FEC, it's taking that speech and putting it into the regulatory authority of the IRS. So instead of having a complaint made with the FEC, you get an IRS agent in to decide whether your engaging in issue advocacy or express advocacy. And I think that's just enormously wrong-headed.
Thank you. Mr. Dickerson.
Well, Chairman, I appreciate the suggestion. My organization, a very few days after the comment period was opened, filed a comment suggesting that if what we're really concerned about here is, specificity and clarity, what we should do is just say political activity is that which the FEC considers political activity. You have to file a report if you do an independent expenditure that's been fully legally vetted up to the Supreme Court of the United States. There's a dollar number on it. That's your candidate-related political activity. If you import those regulations in, you don't have any of these constitutional problems. You've got a clear dollar value that can be applied against your overall budget. We think it's a very elegant solution, and I would suggest those draft regulations.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the indulgence and time, and I think the point was well made that Lois Lerner and others at the FEC have tried to expand the FEC, but even if you expand the FEC, much of exactly what this rule would capture would be outside their jurisdiction, outside the speech that they have any influence in. And I think that's the reason that from the President on down, those who objected to Citizens United and wagged his finger at the U.S. Supreme Court and the well of the House are trying to get a back door of something that even Congress never legislated in the post-Nixon era with the Federal Election Commission. So I certainly think this has been a fruitful discovery. I'm just sorry for the ranking member that he's been so wrong in this hearing. I yield back.
Chairman yields back, and we will recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
If the chairman hadn't said that, I would have had to check and make sure I was in the right hearing room. Ladies and gentlemen,
You're in the right hearing room.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a freshman here in Congress. I am not afflicted with the decades inside the Beltway that many of my brothers and sisters are afflicted with. And what I have come here to Washington to do is to try to seek consensus, try to look for the ways that we can come together on issues in Washington, D.C. that affect the entire nation. Believe it or not, although it doesn't sell newspapers, we do agree on a great many things here in the Congress, and I'm looking to expand those areas. And I think that this hearing is so important because what we're struggling with here is how to solve this problem. You know, when you leave things undefined, when you leave things vague and ambiguous, that's when these fistfights break out. That's when if you've left undefined what political activity is prohibited by this 501c4, and then the IRS, they're at their wits' end trying to make the definition. Well, then if they decide to go one way or the other, one end of the political spectrum ends up being creased and raising the alarm and screaming bloody murder, and that's what we've been hearing for the last year and a half. But it's not a new problem. It's something that Americans have understood, that ambiguity, that uncertainty, that vagueness has existed since 1959. Commentators have mentioned it through the 70s and through the 90s and through the 2000s. And it behooves us to come together and talk about these things. And we've talked about this. There's this tension where on the one hand we have the First Amendment rights to engage in political activity and free speech. And on the other hand, we have this concern that there's going to be dark money. There's going to be undisclosed money financing elections, and we don't know who's behind the money that got this or that candidate elected. I know all of you see that tension, and you understand it. Ms. Martin, I want to congratulate you not only on getting your 501c4, but also on getting your 527. As we know, here in the United States, 527 organizations can engage in political activity, and they do disclose their donors. And that's a very, very important point not to be missed, that disclosing your donors is required in 527 organizations. I'm here to say protecting dark money has to stop. Chairman Issa was here saying, well, the Democrats do that too, and that's well and good. And I think it's got to stop on both sides. This is not just about finger pointing between Democrats and Republicans. It's about making our nation better, making our democracy better. We are the shining light. We are the beacon for the world on how democracy is supposed to work. Let's make it work better. And what I want to do is I want to run down the panel quickly because I want to get a good sense from you. We've heard great comments from all of you, including Senator Allard, Ms. Aviv, Mr. Dickerson, all of you. But I want to get a sense. Do you raise your hand if you think, I'm going to ask you two ways. Do you think we should absolutely not have more specific rules on how 501c4s are allowed to engage in political activity? Should we just not have more specificity and clearing up the ambiguities? Or should we just eliminate all control? How many of you, raise your hand if you think we ought to have better, more specific rules? Okay, seeing 3 hands out of 6. And raise your hand if you think we ought to just have no control over what the 501c4s can do in terms of political activity. Okay, I'm seeing no hands. So I think we're in agreement that there has to be control over the dark money, and I thank you for appearing here today and making that clear.
The gentleman yield for a question.
I yield for a question.
With dark money, so would you have dissented in the NAACP versus Alabama case where the Supreme Court struck down Alabama's forced disclosure of donors to groups like the NAACP who were unquestionably engaged in public issues, not simply that we would define, but of the utmost seriousness and importance, and that ability to conduct anonymous speech was critical, not only in terms of marshaling resources in the African-American community, but imagine if you were a white individual who had sympathy. To be able to stay anonymous allowed you to probably help more than maybe you just didn't have the courage to come out and do it on your own. So would you have wanted to uphold that Alabama statute in order to force the disclosure in that situation?
No, I think not, and I think that's a great question, Ron. I'm glad you asked it. It's something that has to go into the mix. We have to strike the right balance, and because on the one hand we have to protect the people in Alabama, who at that time were doing whatever they could think of to rebel against the oppressive conditions and the violent atmosphere and climate there. But on the other hand, you don't want to give a blank check to dark money, and I think we all agree on that, as the panel does.
Thanks for answering the question. The chair now is going to recognize Mr. Meadows from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I want to apologize to each of you. I had a markup. We've been following this. Our staff has been following it, so I had a markup to go. But I would encourage the gentleman from Pennsylvania to quit using dark money. Since when is free speech dark money? Well, and I'm tired of us. It's like nails on a chalkboard when I hear that, because when we really look at it, it is not dark money. It's moms and dads giving money that, quite frankly, they don't have because they believe in this country.
Well said.
And we need to make sure that we do that. But so I'm not redundant in the questions that may have already been asked. I'm going to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, and I appreciate the gentleman yielding. And a great point was the dark money that funded the Federalist Papers. I mean, this is ridiculous. And what the gentleman suggests is it's okay for some people not to disclose, but other groups need to disclose, and we're going to let the IRS decide which ones those are. That's the gentleman's premise. That's the scariest thing in the world.
Gentleman, yield for a question.
Yes. I mean, you've had more time than any other member on the committee, but yes, go ahead.
Well, we're not talking about letting the IRS decide anything. In fact, it's very much the opposite.
That's what this rule's about. Why do you think we have 6 witnesses, including the Democrat-requested witness, Ms. Aviv, who say this rule is wrong?
Just let me finish the sentence, Jim. What we're talking about is crafting a rule that takes away unfettered discretion from the IRS so that they have bright lines to follow. and then we don't get into these fistfights. That's all my point is.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're all confident that will actually take place if they move in that direction. I would like to.
Will you yield just for one
I'd be
second?
happy. It's amazing. And I'm actually the chairman of this committee, and I get to go there.
Well, I mean, maybe bright line rules are great, but I like Amendment 1, U.S. Constitution, bright line
Well
rules.
said.
Congress shall make no
Well
law.
said. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask to enter into the record a piece that Mr. Dickerson probably thinks is well-written as well. Bradley Smith, a guy that Mr. Dickerson and I both know, has a outstanding piece in today's Wall Street Journal. And I'm actually going to read from this, which I normally don't do when it's my time to ask questions and during my 5 minutes. But this is important because this gets at why it started now, why it wasn't 1959, why it was 2009, why it was now. And Mr. Smith's point is the smoking gun and the targeting of conservative groups has been hiding in plain sight. It's been members of Congress who've asked the IRS, who've pushed the IRS to do exactly what they did, harass people like Jenny Beth Martin and her organization for 3 years. And I'm just going to read the bullet points that Mr. Smith so nicely put in his piece. January 27th, 2010. Not 1959. January 27, 2010, President Obama criticizes Citizen United in the State of the Union address and asks Congress to correct the decision. February 11, 2010, Senator Chuck Schumer says he will introduce legislation known as the Disclose Act to place new restrictions on some political activity by corporations and force more public disclosure of contributions to 501c4 organizations. Mr. Schumer says the bill is intended to, quote, embarrass companies. Not Republicans saying that. Senator Chuck Schumer saying that. Embarrass companies out of exercising their rights recognized in Citizens United. Soon after, March 2010, Mr. Obama publicly criticizes conservative 501c4 organizations engaging in politics. In his August 21 radio address, he warns Americans about shadowy groups with harmless-sounding names. Mr. Mason, are you a shadowy group?
I don't believe so, but I might have to check with my colleague.
Mr. Senator Allard is the Motorcyclist Association. Is there a shadowy group? I mean, they.
Certainly not.
Yeah. I mean, this is amazing. September 28th, 2010, Mr. Obama publicly accuses conservative organization of posing as not-for-profit social welfare and trade groups. Mr. Mason, are you just a poser? Are you just posing, or are you a real social welfare group?
We have been a real social welfare group for decades, doing the same business for many, many years.
Helping lots of families, thousands and thousands of families across the country. October 11th, 2010, Senator Dick Durbin asked the IRS to investigate. Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, I should have added that. Asked the IRS to investigate Crossroads GPS and other organizations. April 2011, White House officials confirmed that Mr. Obama is considering an executive order that would require all government contractors to disclose their donations to politically active organizations. February 16th, 2012, 7 Democratic senators, Michael Bennet, Al Franken, Jeff Merkley, Mr. Schumer, Senator Shaheen, Senator Udall, Senator Whitehouse, write to the IRS, asking for them to investigate conservative 501c4 organizations. That's why they couldn't approve you. Democrat senators said, no, don't. Keep investigating. That's why you had to wait 3 years. That's why you get approved the day before the comment period's up. March 12, 2012, the same 7 Democrats write another letter asking for more investigation of other conservative groups. July 27, 2012, Senator Carl Levin writes one of several letters to then IRS Commissioner Dr. Doug Shulman seeking a probe of 9 conservative groups. August 31st, 2012. In another letter, Senator Levin calls its failure to investigate and prosecute targeted organizations unacceptable. What? He said, Senator Levin says the IRS was failing to target and investigate organizations. You waited 3 years. So what Senator Levin didn't know was the very thing he'd been asking for was going on. The liberal meeting, December 14th, 2012, ProPublica receives Crossroads GPS's 2010 application for tax-exempt status. April 9th, 2013, Senator Whitehouse convenes the Judiciary Committee on Crime and Terror to examine nonprofits. He alleges that nonprofits are violating federal law by making false statements about the activities of donors using shell companies united to to PACs to hide donor identities. May 10th, 2013, Senator Levin announces the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation will hold hearings on, quote, the IRS's failure to enforce the law. November 29th, February, I mean, it just continues. I'll stop because I had 2 more bullet points, which shows how extensive this was. All, again, happening not in 1959, but starting January 27, 2010. Mr. Chairman, again, I ask for unanimous consent to enter this fine piece by Mr. Smith into the record.
Without objection, it shall be entered into the record.
And I yield back all that remaining time.
Oh, yes, thank you. At this point, the chair will recognize the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the chair. By the way, Ms. Martin, does your organization have its tax-exempt status?
As I said in my opening statement just yesterday, after 3 years, 2 months, and 10 days, and the day before this hearing, we got a call from the IRS saying we would be granted it. We still don't have the letter.
Okay. So whatever that attempt to silence you was seems to have failed. Is that right?
I'm sorry, what?
Well, you were indicating in your testimony that I was at earlier that there was some conspiracy to silence your voice.
I didn't say there was a conspiracy to silence my voice. I said there was a silencing effect with the way that we were treated.
Okay.
And there will be a silencing effect of any organization who has to do this, especially when they have to find out how volunteers spend their time, what they say, and what they do. And at which point do you determine whether a volunteer is still affiliated with your organization or acting as an independent and free
Well,
American?
Thank you. As somebody who was very involved in, before your time, in anti-war protests and expressing dissent during the Vietnam War era, I'm very sensitive to the idea that the government would ever attempt to silence voices, even dissenting voices. So even though we probably have very little in common politically, one thing we do have in common is the absolute commitment to making sure all voices are protected in the United States of America. I'm not persuaded that there's any active attempt to squelch your voice, but should there be, I assure you, Democrats, certainly this Democrat, will be on your side. Mr. Rotman, I heard your testimony too, and forgive me, I had to leave. I had a markup that just ended in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Otherwise, I would have been here for all of your testimony. But isn't the issue here about, in terms of who's got what tax-exempt status and what the rules are, doesn't it really boil down to whether or not we want to disclose who our donors are? I mean, for example, you were complaining about whose name could be invoked and who you might use, but isn't that really about whether you wish to disclose your donors or not? I mean, don't we have an awful lot of tax-exempt organizations that have filed who consciously want to make sure that they can protect the anonymity of who funds them?
I would say 2 things. I would say, first of all, that this debate may flow from the concern over the lack of disclosure of donors to groups that are engaged in partisan political activity. But the proposed rule at the IRS goes far beyond that, and it covers a vast amount of legitimate issue advocacy that has nothing to do with partisan politics.
So it
That's the
overreaches, you're saying?
It overreaches, and it also would do very little to tamp down on the phenomena that caused it to be proposed.
Well, let me ask you another question. As I said to Ms. Martin, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. Was very involved in dissent, a different kind of dissent, but dissent. And I did see the government try to squelch that dissent. I saw the government infiltrate organizations that were simply trying to express their point of view about a terrible war. So it does happen, and we have to be always on our guard to make sure it doesn't happen ever again. But I'm also an English lit major, and I always wondered whether that would come in handy here in Congress. And to an English lit major, words mean something. So let me try out on you, Mr. Rotman. I'm reading Section 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code, and it says, civic leagues are organizations not organized for profit but operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. What does the adverb exclusively mean to you? I mean, here's a simple Wikipedia definition. I mean, to the exclusion of others, only or solely, not 60%. When I say to my wife, ours is an exclusive relationship, it doesn't mean 60%. The other 40%, I'm free to sort of roam. It's exclusively our relationship. Primarily means for the most part or mainly. And what I find in this debate is we've sort of lost track of what the English language means. Exclusively does not mean mostly.
Congressman, can I just jump in?
Yes, of course, please.
So, well, you're absolutely right that the statute says exclusively and the regulations say primary purpose. The definition of political intervention for 60 years has been limited as closely as possible to partisan politicking. This rule has very little to do with partisan politicking. It would allow the same type of activity that's ongoing right now, but at the same time, it would cover a vast amount of non-partisan issue advocacy. And that is the concern that you're hearing from both the right and the left.
Yeah, I wish I had a little more time. I would just say, this is something we have to clear up either in the law or with regulations, but exclusively doesn't mean for the most part. That's not what the adverb means. You can look it up in any dictionary. Primarily does mean that.
We don't disagree. And in fact, we've supported an express bright line that would make it very clear and easy to apply by the IRS between partisan political activity and legitimate issue advocacy. And that bright line would end the need for hearings like this and the current controversy.
Yeah. And just a final point, I would say, Mr. Rotman, because I think you make a good point. But remember, it's not just partisanship that's the issue. It's political. It's political involvement. And when you say, I am exclusively a social welfare organization, but what you really mean is, I'm actually, for the most part, a political organization. That's a different matter. And I think we have to get these definitions right. And I think some legislative relief, I think, is frankly going to be in order.
I agree completely, but I would say, though, that partisan politicking aside, if you're engaged in political activity like anti-war protests, you have a right to do that anonymously, and that right should be protected strenuously.
Gentleman's time has
Mr. Chairman,
expired.
I thank you, Chair.
Just real quickly, Mr. Mason, does the Homeschool Legal Defense engage in exclusive activity to better homeschooling for the families you represent?
We have other things that we do as well, but.
But it's all about homeschooling?
Yes.
Yeah, and Mr. Allard, does the Motorcycle Association, are you exclusively focused on better roads, better helmet laws, because you care about exclusively doing things for the motorcyclists who are part of your association?
That's correct. We're
Yeah.
a motorcyclist.
And Ms. Martin, I bet your organization is exclusively about defending the United States Constitution and the principles that you think make America great. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so we're fine. Exclusive is the right word. We're all fine. But this new rule would say, now you got big problems. Now you got big problems. Because it tries to define what political, that's, again, why this thing is so absurd and why everyone across the political, as I said before, from the Tea Party to the ACLU, from the homeschoolers to the Harley riders, everyone knows this rule is bad. Everyone knows it, except this administration. Everyone except this administration. And that's why this hearing was important and why we had such a great panel. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thanks for that, and I really appreciate the witnesses coming. I think you all did a wonderful job, and I think clearly this rule cannot stand. It is way overbroad. It will chill core First Amendment speech, and I know we're going to be moving legislation through Congress. Hopefully, the Senate will agree. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to speak. People need to be able to consume or to pool their resources. And the thing that amazes me is you chill these 501c4s from getting involved in different issues. Guess what? That actually gives more power to people who are very wealthy who can just stroke an individual check on their own. So you're not making it more democratic. You're making it more difficult to speak. This committee stands adjourned.